Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to be getting the old Tamiya Midnight Pumpkin up and running. It's an original 1987 vintage model. It's seen quite a bit of use, but it's not going to take too much to get it going. Here's what we're going to be fitting. Yet another Hobby King X-Car 45 amp brushed ESC, a FlySky 3-channel receiver for a Hobby King / FR Sky GT3B with modded firmware of course. We'll need to replace the wheelie bar, so I've got a nice little aircraft tail wheel, and of course a new wheelie bar, a new pair of springs for the axle, a Kyosho magnetic Mayhem motor. It's a 550, but I'm pretty sure it's what I used to run last time it was running. An 18-tooth pinion rather than the 10-tooth the Pumpkin comes with. The Mag Mayhem will still have plenty of torque to wheelie, and it'll add a nice bit of top end. Lastly, we need a set of body mounts. These ones provided by the Lowride Pumpkin we just finished building. We'll almost certainly need some assorted screws and nuts, probably some washers too, but we'll figure those out as we go. Right, body off first, which is easy as there's no body posts. Now we can see the worn out wheelie bar. If you have one and the little wheel falls out, replace it before running it anymore. The other bits we need to get at are the little springs that hold the axle down. You can just about see it on the inside of the axle mount. To get at it, we need to remove rather a lot of the chassis. First though, we might as well remove the rear wheels, just a single nut like modern models, but instead of a hex there's a drive plate that locks in with some nubs on the back of the wheel. Now we can start removing the screws in the bottom of the chassis. The ones we really need to get at are just out of reach. You can kind of get in with a screwdriver, but at that angle there's an extremely high risk of stripping the screw heads. All the screws are the same size, so as we go we can just dump them into a plastic pot. The bottom bit where the battery mounts is held on with 7 screws, 6 of which we can get at. To get at the last one we need to remove the T-plate that holds the front arms in. 3 more screws, lift it out and pull the arms free. Remove the last screw and the bottom bit should just come away. Now we can cleanly get to the screws that hold the axle mounts on. Take them out, and other than the bottom spring retainers, the axle is free. The retainers are clipped on to a couple of ball ends. Be careful with the old plastic. It'll be a bit harder than new stuff. If you really stress it, it could split. Flip the axle over and work the mounts out from the chassis. A gentle pull and some wiggling will get them out. Which leaves us with the axle and mounts nicely free from the chassis. Now, before we swap the springs on the mounts and rebuild, we might as well do the other bits on the axle while it's all nice and accessible. So, wheelie bar first. We've got a nice little 15mm aircraft tail wheel to use. It's a lot cheaper than getting the parts tree with the stock wheel, but it will need a little bit of work to make it fit. I'm going to use a stock wheelie bar. If you keep an eye out, they pop up on eBay from people parting out the kits. There's some aftermarket wheelie bars around too, and they do look rather nice, but I want to keep a fairly stock appearance on this model. The wheel has an aluminium hub, which is nice, but the hole is very small, really meant to run on a bit of piano wire. What we've got though is a long M3 bolt with a smooth bit that will work perfectly as a shaft for the wheel to run on. The problem though, if we just drill the aluminium hub to run on the steel shaft, it will last all of 10 minutes before it's wobbling around. Easy fix though. Some brass tube with a 3mm internal diameter pressed into a 3.9mm hole drilled into the hub. To get it to fit, I warmed up the hub with a tile removed to make it expand and froze the brass to make it shrink. There's no glue or solder. Once the parts are the same temperature, they're not going to be going anywhere. The brass is a lot harder than the aluminium, so it's going to last a long time as a bearing. And while I was at it, I chopped the excess off the screw. To put it together, we'll need some M3 washers and a nylock nut. The wheel is fairly narrow, so we need to pass the screw through the wheelie bar a bit and put it together with a washer on either side of the wheel. This will give it a nice hard surface to run on with the inevitable side loads. It'll also make sure the tyre can't rub on the aluminium bar. At the very least, we need a washer under the nut too. It'd probably be a good idea to have one under the screw head as well. We won't be doing the nut up tight. We need to make sure the wheel's still free to spin. Too tight and it will pinch the ends and make it bind. Now we can remove the manky old one. There's 2 screws, one short and one long, so we need to keep track of which is which. The new bar is a perfect fit, but that's not too surprising as it's a Tamiya replacement. It looks a lot cleaner now, a bit more functional, and it still looks fairly original, which will do the job nicely. Motor next, a good old Kyosho Magnetic Mayhem. 21 turns if I remember correctly, and it's a 550 rather than a 540, so it's a little bit longer, which can cause issues on some models, but on the Pumpkin there's plenty of space. The stock pinion is 10 tooth and needs a funky adapter to make it fit. You need the small pinion with a stock silver can motor to get nice wheelies. However, because we've got a nice torquey motor, we can use the bigger 18 tooth. We'll still have more than enough oomph to wheelie and gain quite a bit of speed. It was my favourite combination in the early 2000s. It's a shame the old Mag Mayhems are so hard to find. We should really make a little cover plate for the hole in the gearbox, but for now I'll stick a bit of tape over it. Not brilliant, but it'll get us going. The motor doesn't have any wires at the moment, and it just so happens we removed two perfectly good ones from the low-ride Pumpkin. They just need soldering onto the tabs. Because of the motor's extra length and the way the wires route, it works best to have them lie along the top of the motor. Gearbox mount springs next. There's a screw and a washer on the inside face of the mounts. Remove the screw and pop a spring over the boss. The idea being that the axle can move up and down in a slot for a little bit of articulation. The springs help keep it straight. I think in reality they don't actually do much, but I'm sure it's better to have them fitted than not. And now, the rebuild. Right, slot in one of the axle mounts, giving it a good wiggle until it's all the way in. Axle next, sit it on the bottom of the chassis and slot it into the mount, making sure it's sitting on the right side of the spring. The other mount, giving it a nice wiggle to fully seat. Carefully flip the axle over and refit the 4 screws into the axle mounts. They can be a bit fiddly. If you can't get them in, it can help to pop a finger in and hold the mount against the chassis, so it doesn't keep moving around. That's the axle in place, so now it's not going to fall out. We can clip the spring retainers back onto the ball ends. And, just like when we remove them, be a bit careful with the old plastic. Now for the rest of the screws. I feel like a time-lapse might work here. There's the 7 for the bottom chassis battery holder bit, and the 3 for the T-plate, like so. To plug up the gearbox, I'll just use a bit of sellotape. It'll keep the dust out. But I really need to make up a proper cover, probably out of a bit of scrap aluminium, unless I can find one for a Tamiya Hornet. The wheels can go back on now too, and there we have a rolling chassis. Okay, electronics. There's already an old ACOM servo in there. It's old, but it will work just fine with a modern radio, so we might as well keep it. The ESC needs to be mounted, so it will reach the motor with a little bit of slack in the wires to account for the gearbox movement. And the battery lead will need to reach the battery. The battery retainer on one side is fixed, moulded to the chassis. On the other side it hinges out for access. We'll make this the battery lead end. A bit of servo tape to stick in the ESC. The flat spot, usually for the receiver, is a nice convenient spot. The motor wires can pass through the hole originally meant for the mechanical speed controller's resistor. They just plug in with the bullet connectors, keeping plenty of slack so when the gearbox moves about it's not going to pull on anything. Receiver next. We can plug in the servo and ESC. We could get away with having the antenna just in the chassis, but there's a perfectly good spot for an antenna tube, and having the antenna up high isn't going to hurt. We can stick the receiver on the face just below the ESC and run the antenna up and around to the antenna tube. Right then, time for a test. As always, we need to make sure it can't just drive off on its own, so we need to pop something under the gearbox to keep the wheels off the ground. Okay, pull the trigger a bit, and we get forward. Push it away twice, and there's reverse. And the steering works too. Perfect. Nearly there. Next we have the body mounts. They're from the same sprue as the body tailgate. They would have been white on this kit, but since we've got a set of black ones from the low-ride Pumpkin, we might as well use them. There's 2 pairs, 2 short ones for the rear, and 2 longer ones that go at the front. To fit them, we'll need some Tamiya self-tappers. These are, again, probably from the low-ride Pumpkin kit too. To spread the load a bit, it's not a bad idea to use some washers too. The mountings for the mounts are open slots rather than holes, so we can loosely fit the screws to the chassis first. Except for this one, which seems to have the thread stripped, so we'll have to come up with something else. For the 3 we can fit, all we need to do is lift the washer, slide the mount under it and tighten up the screw. For the one with the stripped thread, we'll use a machine screw and a nut, with a couple of washers. Screw with a washer goes up from the bottom, slide in the mount, followed by another washer and an M3 nylock nut. do it up, and we've got a perfectly serviceable body mount. Right, body on. It should just drop down over the posts and the antenna mount. And we can use some body clips, 2 on the back and 2 on the front. Hang on, there's no hole. Nowhere to fit the clip. Yeah, look at that. There's some little circles, but no holes. There's a thing. Oh well, we only need to run a 1mm drill bit through them, so it's not a huge problem. How very strange. Right, holes drilled and mounts fitted. Let's try that again. The front body clips. I drilled them so the clips run front to back rather than in from the side. I seem to remember the ends of the clips used to rub on the body something awful, so it'll hopefully help a little bit. All that's left then is a quick outdoor test. Now, I did forget to turn the microphone on, so you can't actually hear it go, but it did sound nice and smooth. And the rear rubber wheel on the wheelie bar does take that crack out of the wheelies. The old Mag Mayhem still pulls it around with some authority. No problems doing wheelies, even on an almost flat battery. After a full charge, I'd bet it would hold a wheelie for quite a good distance. There's a few mods that people do to these, the most common being oil dampers. I'm sure it would make the truck a lot smoother to run, but I think the wobbly bounciness is a big part of the chassis' charm. One thing I could do with doing though is the front suspension is a little bit soft. The old springs are struggling a bit, and from memory Traxxas preload spacers fit over the chrome bodies, so 1 on each side should do the trick. And that's about it, all up and running. So thanks for watching, comment if you're feeling chatty, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't already, and there's that little bell jobby everybody keeps mentioning now, so you might want to click that too. Bye guys.